Hi everyone, welcome to week 7 in English 102. So I know that the last few weeks have been kind of fast and furious, and we're still in the middle of doing our primary research for this ethnography project, but I wanted to take some time this week to start thinking about drafting our paper that's going to kind of discuss all of the sources you've found so far, your primary research, and then essentially what you've learned about this community throughout this process. So between this week, next week, and then the week after spring break, we're going to spend a lot of time sort of piecing together all of the information that you found into kind of a workable draft. So if you're like a little kind of overwhelmed at this point, that is normal. It's a lot to keep track of, and honestly, I like to think of this as a puzzle that we're sort of putting together piece by piece, and some of it might still not look like it's gonna fit, but then in the next few weeks you'll be like, oh my gosh, it's all fallen into place. So if you're kind of like, I don't really know what's happening, normal, totally fine. This whole process is messy. But this week and next, hopefully you'll get a better idea of what we're going for, and you'll get a little more comfortable with where you are in your research. So this video is going to talk about writing a working thesis and then outlining your ethnography. So let's go ahead and get started. So your assignments for this week, we do have a discussion board due on Thursday, and that's actually going to ask you to write a working thesis. So our readings for this week, and I'm going to go over a handout and some information in this video as well, all focus on, okay, what's a working thesis and how do I get to one? And then on Sunday, what you'll have do is your primary research results and analysis, and then you have the opportunity for some extra credit in writing an ethnography outline. So the outline is hugely beneficial. I encourage everyone to do the outline, but I'm offering it for extra credit because I kind of readjusted our primary research and I didn't want to kind of overwhelm you all, but I think it's still important to kind of pre-plan before we draft your research paper. So we're going to talk about each of these assignments in a little more detail. So let's start first with a working thesis. So once you oops, I got it all out of order. Just kidding. We're going to come back to that paper. All right. So first of all, when I talk about a working thesis, this is something one of your readings this week will discuss. It's Krauss chapter 5. So essentially, you've probably heard what a thesis is from English 101. This is really your argument, your stance, your opinion about your topic that's stated very clearly towards the end of an introductory paragraph. And here Krauss says, a thesis advocates a specific and debatable issue. Some other ideas with a working thesis is that it can and will change as you write your research paper. So what you write in our discussion board this week, I'll give you some feedback. You'll get feedback from other classmates. And then you also, as you kind of get your primary research results and start thinking about how all of your sources fit together, you might change what you believe about this community. And that's okay. It will change. And that's just the process of writing and doing research. But essentially, your working thesis is the answer to your research question, all right? So you started with this question about the community and the sort of group that you were looking at for your ethnography, and your working thesis is going to be, now that you've gathered this information, how would you answer that question? So let's look at a couple examples. First of all, remember that a thesis can change. I think this is something a lot of people struggle with because we focus so much on writing a strong thesis for a paper. You have to decide, okay, what do I believe before I start writing? And then you get to the end though, and you're like, wait a second, what I've got here is entirely different from where I started. And that, my friends, is actually a good thing. That means that you're really thinking through and you're really processing and really synthesizing what the information you're gathering is about. So this quote here I really like. It says, the defining characteristic of a working thesis is that it is flexible. What makes it working is that you're subject to change as your ideas develop. Okay, so again, what you write this week and what you end up with in your final draft in, I believe, week 9 will change, and that's okay. This week is really just about starting to kind of bring all of this together. So say my research question was about doing yoga. Huge yoga fan, do it every day. And I noticed that yoga seems to be really popular among women And I was wondering why it's not more of a male pursuit. So after I did some preliminary source work research and did a survey actually with a few of my classes, I found that in my experience as a person who does yoga, I found that more teachers are female. And it makes sense that female practitioners of yoga would also look for female instructors. But I did find in a lot of discussion that this is changing as people use yoga more for athletic recovery. So I'm actually seeing more men participating in yoga, but as a sort of recovery instead of women using it for more of a sort of group activity. So this was just one example of a working thesis, but you see that I've taken my research question first, and then my thesis is the answer to it. So another example, what if I was looking at why baking is becoming cooler? And this is something I've also noticed. I feel like I've enjoyed baking for most of my adult life, but I've definitely noticing it becoming more popular just in like mainstream. So I found that baking is becoming cooler primarily because of social media and reality TV shows, and that these focus more on baking as an art and less about baking as a sort of family value. And in my paper, what I would do then is talk about these reality shows and examples from social media about how baking is more about that art and skill and less about emphasizing women and wives particularly in the kitchen kind of thing. So these are just two examples of what I'm trying to do from going from my research question to my working thesis. So this is part of what I want you guys to focus on this week. So now I'm going to actually go back to the slide that discusses the paper as a whole. Okay, so as it says here, your ethnography paper, we are getting ready to write them. But before we kind of dive in, I want you guys to think about each piece of this project and how we're now kind of bringing them all together. So what you'll notice is that the sections of the paper, some of these might look familiar. So first, you're going to start with a background on your culture. It says, much like your proposal, your ethnography should start with the background of your local culture and your experience in it. This is a great place for anecdotes or narratives describing your culture in detail. Your research questions are going to come next. So what questions did you start with and how did these develop? And then your methodology, you're going to just describe where you went for resources, how you conducted your primary and your secondary research and why. So these first three are actually the same as your ethnography proposal. So when you actually start to draft your ethnography, what you can do is go back to your proposal, move that information into your draft and adjust it, having now done the research. Because, your proposal is pre-research, your ethnography draft is post. So even if you're going to use some of that same information, you do want to adjust it. You are not just copying and pasting, but you're saying, okay, this is where I started and here's where I ended up. The next section of your research essay is called the findings. And this is actually probably the most important section of the entire paper, the entire project, because this is where you say, okay, here's what I found. This is what I now know based on these sources and the research I've done. So what you do in your findings section is this is what's going to feel, I would say, most like a traditional research paper. So you're going to start with a paragraph that kind of introduces your specific research and then ends with your working thesis. So that answer to your research question we just talked about, that's what's going to go in your findings, all right? And then the rest of your findings is going to help kind of support your thesis, your argument about this culture, all right? So if in my findings I wanted to talk about that yoga example and I wanted to talk about how yoga is traditionally primarily female-based, especially in the US, but that's changing, then I would talk about, I have this source that talks about the kind of statistics of women in yoga, but then I also have this source that says that this many men participate, so it's not just one-sided. Then I might talk about the survey I did in 2 of my classes, asking students about their experience with yoga and how that kind of adjusted what I thought. So this findings section is really where you're kind of working through each of those sources and finding similarities between them. So in this finding section, you can think about grouping your sources either by similarities. You could group them by differences. You could group them by sort of chronologically by like oldest to newest or newest to oldest, if that works for your topic. But think about just, looking at your sources from your bibliography and your primary research. Just ask yourself, okay, how are these fitting together now? What are they telling me? And overall, what conclusion can I gain from those? Then you're going to have a conclusion to that and your references, which is going to include all of the sources you've used throughout the project. So the goal in a few weeks is to have 6 to 8 pages with all of this included. But remember, you've already done the background on your culture, the research questions, the methodology, and you've already started your references. So when you're actually drafting, it's going to be a lot easier than it seems because you've already been doing this in pieces. All right. So the other assignment I'm giving you an option to do is an outline this week. So I've created an outline document. It's on Blackboard. It is extra credit. It's worth about as much as a discussion board post. So in this outline, you can just answer the questions one by one in order. They're all there for you, focusing particularly on your findings. And if you turn that in, I can give you some feedback on it before you start drafting next week. And hopefully that'll set you up for success. It's not required, but like I said, I do encourage everyone to complete that. So great work so far, guys. We are on the home stretch of this first project, and I am really, really excited to kind of see how these develop for you into actual research drafts. So if you have any questions, please reach out, and I will talk to you soon.